Disrespect never starts with words. It starts the moment someone senses they can touch you without consequence. Most people try to correct it with emotion. That is why it never stops. By the end of this, your reactions will slow down. Your presence will become heavier without effort. People will feel resistance before they cross you. You will be harder to read, and therefore harder to test. Disrespect is rarely personal and almost never emotional. It is opportunistic. Most people are not consciously trying to undermine you, they are responding to signals. They observe tone, posture, speed of reaction, and emotional leakage. They test lightly at first, often unconsciously, to see what they can get away with. When they sense hesitation, the need to explain, or the desire to be accepted, they adjust their behavior accordingly. This is not cruelty. It is social physics. Very few people understand this, which is why most try to fix disrespect by appealing to fairness, logic, or emotion, methods that only confirm vulnerability. The unaware believe disrespect happens because others are rude or insecure. The aware know it happens because something was exposed. Power dynamics are not driven by intention, they are driven by perception. When someone feels safe crossing a line, it is because they believe there will be no meaningful consequence. That belief forms quickly and silently. A slight change in tone, a delayed response, a defensive explanation, these are enough. Once the opening exists, it widens on its own. This is why emotional correction fails. Emotion communicates that the behavior affected you. Once that information is released, it cannot be taken back. You may win the argument, but you lose leverage. Disrespect does not retreat from confrontation, it studies it. Every reaction teaches others how to engage with you. Most people unknowingly train those around them how to treat them, then feel confused when the pattern repeats. The strategic mind reframes the situation entirely. Disrespect is not an insult, it is data. It reveals how others currently categorize you in their internal hierarchy. When you stop personalizing it, you gain clarity. You no longer rush to defend identity or status. Instead, you observe, adjust, and close the opening. This is where real control begins, not in demanding respect, but in becoming someone whose reactions cannot be exploited. Those who hold power understand a simple truth. Behavior changes fastest when access, energy, or opportunity is altered. Words are secondary. When you respond to disrespect with composure and strategic distance, you communicate something deeper than dominance. You communicate self-possession, and people instinctively recalibrate around that. Machiavelli understood that the fastest way to eliminate disrespect is rarely through confrontation or verbal correction. Words carry emotion, and emotion signals vulnerability. When you attempt to lecture, scold, or justify yourself, you are showing others the levers they can pull. They sense the pressure points, the openings, the subtle cracks in composure. Most people respond to this unknowingly, and in doing so, they increase their own power over you. True control is never displayed in a debate, it is exercised in the absence of need to argue. Distance, absence, and withdrawal communicate far more than speech ever can. When someone crosses a boundary, the most effective response is to reduce access rather than demand acknowledgement. Stop answering their messages immediately, limit your interactions, or remove yourself from situations where they can test you. This is not about punishment, it is about recalibration. The human mind notices what is no longer available and assigns value accordingly. When something is removed, its importance grows, and behaviors that were previously acceptable are reconsidered. Machiavelli described this principle not as cruelty, but as strategy. The strongest influence often comes from what is withheld, not what is displayed. Most people never realize how much power lies in selective engagement. They think confrontation is the measure of strength because it is visible, it is loud, and it can be praised. But strategic withdrawal is quiet, almost invisible, yet infinitely more effective. It forces the other party to confront the reality that their actions have consequences beyond immediate feedback. They are no longer in a world where they can test limits without resistance. They begin to calculate, to hesitate, to reconsider. Respect forms in that space where action has measurable effect, not in the vacuum of unchecked emotion. This method also protects your energy and clarity. Engaging emotionally with disrespect creates turbulence, drawing attention and focus away from long-term control. By responding with removal or distance, you preserve both your presence and your influence. People begin to read you differently, not as someone who reacts predictably, but as someone whose boundaries are tangible and unassailable. It is a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, yet it fundamentally changes the dynamic of any interaction. Those who practice this consistently find that disrespect decreases dramatically, not because others suddenly understand morality, but because they now understand that crossing you carries immediate, unavoidable consequences. Tone carries far more weight than words ever could. Most people believe that what they say defines their authority or control, but in truth, it is how they say it, the subtleties of pitch, pace, and resonance that communicate strength or weakness. A sharp argument delivered with tension exposes insecurity. A calm, measured voice, on the other hand, communicates mastery before a single point is understood. Machiavelli recognized this principle in the behavior of princes and generals. The perception of control is more powerful than the reality of it, and tone is the primary vehicle for that perception. People rarely process the exact words being spoken in the moment. They respond first to the energy behind them. When tone reflects hesitation, urgency, or emotional investment, it invites challenge. When it reflects calm, inevitability, and certainty, it creates pause, hesitation, and compliance. Silence amplifies this effect. Those who rush to fill gaps with speech signal that they require understanding, approval, or acknowledgement. Each explanation, no matter how precise, exposes you to scrutiny and evaluation. The moment you feel compelled to clarify, you are already on the defensive, whether you realize it or not. Silence, delivered with steady composure, communicates far more than clarification ever could. It signals that you are unaffected, that the world moves around you, not against you. Disrespect, when met with unshakable silence, loses momentum. The aggressor begins to internalize the gap. Why does this person not respond? What power or calculation am I missing? That uncertainty alone alters behavior in your favor. Tone also defines boundaries without announcement. Most people use words to create limits, yet words are negotiable. Anyone can debate a boundary or rationalize around it. Tone, however, communicates the emotional reality of that limit. It is unmovable, unyielding, and unquestionable. When your tone is steady, detached, and firm, it forms a framework that others unconsciously align to. They sense not only what you will do, but what you will not do, and the mere perception of that certainty creates automatic respect. Very few people understand that authority is often the art of subtle intimidation, not loud, not harsh, not aggressive, but unmistakably firm. A quiet, deliberate voice communicates that you are anchored in your own world, that your internal state is independent of external provocation. Furthermore, tone shapes the narrative before words can. People often misinterpret speech based on emotion rather than content. A defensive tone transforms a neutral statement into a weakness. An indifferent tone transforms a critical observation into a fact that cannot be challenged. Mastery of tone allows you to manipulate perception without conflict. The aggressive, loud, or reactive will always trigger engagement because they signal availability. Calm dominance, however, signals unavailability emotionally, socially, and psychologically. Those who cross lines or attempt to undermine you will hesitate when faced with a tone that is unassailable. They will second-guess, adjust, and retreat, often without realizing why. In practice, this requires deliberate self-regulation. Monitor not only the words you speak, but the undercurrent of energy behind them. Do not allow external pressures to dictate cadence or volume. Speak slowly, evenly, and with minimal fluctuation in pitch. Let your voice carry certainty, not agitation. Let pauses weigh more than explanations. Over time, your tone becomes a natural extension of authority. People respond before they even process the content of your statements. They respect, fear, or defer instinctively because tone communicates inevitability and control, and nothing invites challenge more than the illusion of uncontested mastery. This is the essence of quiet dominance. It is not the words that command, it is the voice, the presence, the energy that signals unmovable power. Those who understand and control tone need never raise themselves to match disrespect. Their authority is already assumed, inevitable, and silently enforced. Disrespect thrives on reaction. This is a truth most people never fully grasp. They believe that responding proves strength, that defending themselves or asserting their position will command respect. In reality, the act of reacting reveals predictability, and predictability is the currency of manipulation. When someone crosses a boundary and you respond immediately, you provide feedback on how they can influence you, how much pressure to apply, and which levers are effective. Every emotional response communicates vulnerability, whether it is anger, frustration, or even polite correction. Those who are skilled in social dynamics do not need to push hard, they only need to wait for the signs. The unaware, however, hand them these signs freely. The strategic mind understands that silence, delay, and measured response invert this dynamic. By withholding immediate reaction, you remove the reward that disrespect seeks. The aggressor begins to feel dissonance, confusion, or uncertainty. They expect confrontation or emotional acknowledgement, and when it does not arrive, the foundation of their behavior is challenged. Humans are wired to seek patterns and predictability. When one suddenly disappears, they are forced to reconsider, recalibrate, and in most cases, retreat. Disrespect, like water, seeks the path of least resistance. When resistance becomes silent, consistent, and unwavering, it redirects the flow, forcing compliance without overt confrontation. Reaction is often fueled by the belief that intensity equals authority. Shouting louder, arguing harder, or asserting oneself publicly is seen as dominance. But those who understand true power know that energy spent reacting is energy surrendered. Every word, every motion, every inflection becomes data for the observant, teaching them exactly how to behave in the future. A reactive person is transparent, and transparency is the doorway through which disrespect enters. By contrast, controlled inaction, measured pauses, or minimal verbal acknowledgement create ambiguity. Ambiguity makes people cautious, uncertain, and ultimately respectful, because they cannot predict the consequences of their actions. This principle also applies to social hierarchies and group dynamics. When a disrespectful comment or challenge occurs in public, most people feel compelled to respond immediately, to assert dominance in front of witnesses. Yet public reaction is often counterproductive. It signals vulnerability to the socially aware, while encouraging the unaware to continue testing limits. The quiet, delayed response communicates more than words ever could. It establishes a standard without the need for argument. The audience, observing without intervention, internalizes your authority. Disrespect becomes risky to display because the cost of misjudging your response is now higher than the reward of challenge. Moreover, measured non-reaction sharpens your own perception. When you pause, you create mental space to assess intention, timing, and potential consequences. You gain insight into the disrespect itself, whether it is casual, habitual, or deliberate. This insight allows for strategic calibration, deciding when to act, how to act, or when complete inaction is the superior choice. Most people never reach this level of awareness. They live in the cycle of provocation and reaction, continuously teaching others how to navigate their boundaries. The few who master restraint, however, achieve a position of quiet dominance. Their calmness is contagious, their unpredictability intimidating, and their authority unquestioned. Reacting may feel satisfying in the moment, but measured restraint ensures control, influence, and long-term respect, making it the true antidote to disrespect. Boundaries are the invisible architecture of power. Most people approach them as polite suggestions or moral obligations, announcing them with words and hoping others comply. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of how respect and authority operate. Boundaries are not statements to be negotiated. They are forces to be experienced. When you announce a boundary verbally, you immediately create an opportunity for challenge. People interpret words as flexible, debatable, or temporary. They will test, probe, and exploit the gray area between what is said and what is enforced. In this sense, most proclaimed boundaries become invitations rather than deterrents. Real authority is established not through explanation but through demonstration. Consequences speak louder than any declaration. Machiavelli observed this in his analysis of power. Those who rely on words alone inevitably invite testing, whereas those who structure consequences create behavior that enforces itself. The strongest boundaries are structural, not verbal. They manifest through changes in access, opportunity, and consequence. When someone crosses a line, the reaction should be embedded in reality, not conversation. If a subordinate, colleague, or acquaintance behaves disrespectfully, immediate structural adjustment is far more effective than debate. This could mean reducing personal access, limiting interactions, or altering the conditions under which engagement occurs. The point is not to punish emotionally, but to let reality communicate the limit. Human behavior responds to patterns of consequence far more reliably than to appeals, explanations, or moral lectures. People learn quickly when the cost of crossing a line is tangible and unavoidable. In this way, boundaries become self-enforcing. They do not rely on your energy, vigilance, or approval, and the effect persists long after the initial act of enforcement. Consistency is the cornerstone of this strategy. One decisive adjustment communicates authority, but repeated inconsistency erodes it. Most people overcorrect when faced with disrespect. They react with too much intensity, too quickly, or unevenly. Overcorrection signals insecurity, a need to be seen or approved. It invites repeated testing because it reveals that authority is negotiable. A single, clean, structural adjustment, however, communicates inevitability. It teaches without explanation. The line is clear, the cost is understood, and the pattern requires no further elaboration. When this approach is applied consistently, others internalize the boundaries quickly. They begin to adjust behavior before they even risk crossing you, effectively curtailing disrespect without confrontation. Another critical factor is timing. Boundaries are not static. Their enforcement must align with context, opportunity, and strategic advantage. Acting too soon may reveal oversensitivity, while acting too late allows disrespect to establish momentum. The ideal moment is precise, enough for the offense to be noticed, but not so much that it becomes normalized. This requires observation, patience, and awareness. Timing reinforces authority in ways that words cannot. The observant perceive not just that a boundary exists, but that it operates with precision and control. This quiet, calculated enforcement signals mastery over both environment and self, creating a psychological weight that deters future transgressions. Boundaries also operate through perception. Most people assume that visibility and vocal assertion are required to maintain authority, yet the opposite is often true. Subtle adjustments in behavior communicate limits more powerfully than overt confrontation. A change in availability, a shift in energy, a measured withdrawal from interaction, all of these signal consequence without argument. The human mind fills the silence with speculation, often overestimating the cost of crossing the line. Machiavelli noted that uncertainty amplifies respect. When people are unsure of the boundaries, limits, or consequences, they err on the side of caution. Awareness of this principle allows you to enforce limits quietly, efficiently, and permanently. Finally, the internalization of boundaries transforms the social dynamic. When you enforce structural consequences, you shift responsibility for behavior onto the other party. Disrespect becomes their choice, not your failure. They feel the weight of their actions without requiring verbal reprimand. Over time, they learn to navigate your presence with care, internalizing respect as a natural response to structure and consistency. This is the highest form of authority, when the environment itself teaches compliance and behavior is shaped without energy expenditure or argument. Those who master this approach are rarely challenged openly because the cost of crossing them has become self-evident. Respect, in this case, is not demanded, it is unavoidable. The essence of elite boundary enforcement is restraint, clarity, and consequence. Words are limited, action is absolute. By structuring your world so that disrespect carries immediate, tangible consequences, you create an ecosystem where authority is inherent, testing is minimized, and self-mastery is communicated silently but unmistakably. This is how power operates in its purest form, invisible, undeniable, and quietly enforced. Consistency, precision, and consequence are the tools. The effect is automatic respect. Those who understand this principle move through social environments with influence that requires no explanation, no argument, and no struggle, because the boundaries themselves speak volumes. Overcorrection is one of the most common mistakes people make when dealing with disrespect. Most assume that to assert authority, they must respond with intensity, elaboration, or repeated enforcement. In reality, overcorrection signals insecurity. It reveals that control is fragile, that authority is conditional, and that the individual is reacting from need rather than mastery. Very few understand that true dominance is measured not by how much force is applied, but by how little is necessary to achieve the desired effect. One decisive, clean action communicates more than repeated responses ever could. It establishes standards, enforces consequences, and leaves no room for negotiation. Consistency is the hidden power behind minimal correction. When someone crosses a line and encounters a calm, unwavering response, they immediately recognize that testing limits is futile. They understand that the boundary is not situational, not emotional, and not negotiable. Most people fail to see this because they mistake force for authority. They escalate their own energy to match the offense, overcompensating in both effort and emotion. The result is predictable. The offender learns that boundaries are conditional and continues testing. A single measured adjustment repeated with exact consistency removes this ambiguity. It communicates inevitability, an outcome far more intimidating than any loud confrontation. The psychology behind minimal correction is simple but profound. Human behavior is guided by reinforcement. If an action is met with delayed, measured, or singular consequence, the mind quickly learns to avoid repetition. If the response is loud, reactive, or unpredictable, the mind interprets it as opportunity. The rules are flexible, the outcome is uncertain, and testing is safe. Most people inadvertently teach others how to treat them by overcorrecting. Those who master restraint, however, invert the dynamic. The offender begins to anticipate consequence rather than opportunity. Disrespect becomes costly, immediate, and unavoidable. Timing and precision amplify the effect. One well-timed adjustment conveys control far more effectively than multiple, scattered reactions. The action does not need to be public or dramatic. It must simply be consistent, swift in execution, and aligned with the reality of the offense. The simplicity of the approach also protects your energy. Emotional overreaction drains attention, focus, and authority. Minimal, clean enforcement preserves both presence and perception. In essence, the power of correction lies not in volume, repetition, or spectacle. It lies in accuracy and consistency. By overcorrecting, most people teach others that boundaries are negotiable. By correcting once, cleanly, and reliably, you teach the world that boundaries are immutable. This is the foundation of elite influence: predictable, inescapable, and quiet dominance that cannot be tested or challenged without immediate consequence. Those who master this principle rarely face repeated disrespect, because the lesson is clear, unavoidable, and deeply understood. Silence is often misunderstood. Most people associate it with weakness, hesitation, or uncertainty, but in reality, it is one of the most powerful tools in maintaining authority. The need to clarify, defend, or justify oneself is a vulnerability that almost everyone carries unconsciously. When someone disrespects you, the instinctive reaction is to explain, to argue, or to assert a point. Each word, no matter how precise, exposes emotional investment and creates patterns others can exploit. The more you speak to correct behavior, the more you reveal yourself. Those who understand power know that restraint communicates far more than explanation ever could. Silence is the language of control because it signals that your presence, your boundaries, and your internal state are not negotiable or influenced by external stimuli. Uncontrolled speech provides clarity to the observer, often more than intended. The aggressor or disrespectful party learns exactly which words provoke, which actions elicit responses, and which emotional triggers are available to manipulate. Silence removes all of that information. When you remain quiet, the offender is forced to confront uncertainty. Why does this person not respond? What are they thinking? How far can I push before consequence? The human mind reacts instinctively to uncertainty, often overcompensating and second-guessing its own behavior. This hesitation, born from your silence, creates space for authority to assert itself without effort or confrontation. The strategic value of silence extends beyond immediate interaction. When you choose not to react, you shift the responsibility for understanding, interpreting, and adjusting back onto the other party. They must read the situation, anticipate your next move, and consider the consequences of continued disrespect. In doing so, you remain psychologically unassailable. Silence also protects your energy and mental clarity. Engaging in argument or explanation draws focus away from observation, calculation, and self-possession. By staying quiet, you maintain control over your internal state while simultaneously guiding the behavior of others. Moreover, silence transforms the social dynamic subtly but powerfully. Most people assume authority is visible and demonstrable, but true dominance is often invisible. It exists in the hesitation you create, in the gap of your non-reaction, and in the psychological weight your presence carries. People sense control not only in action, but in restraint, and silence is the ultimate expression of that restraint. Those who understand this principle rarely need to correct disrespect verbally, because their composure itself teaches the lesson. The absence of words becomes a signal that authority exists beyond debate, beyond negotiation, and beyond challenge. In effect, silence is not passive, it is active dominance. It allows you to observe, to calculate, and to shape interactions without exposing leverage. It converts uncertainty into influence, restraint into power, and hesitation into respect. Those who wield it consistently become unreadable, untouchable, and quietly, inevitably dominant. Emotional neutrality is one of the most underestimated weapons in the arsenal of power. Most people mistake engagement, anger, frustration, indignation for authority, believing that forceful displays of emotion demonstrate dominance. In truth, emotional reactivity is the easiest avenue for manipulation because it communicates availability and predictability. The moment you show that a word, action, or challenge affects you, you have provided a roadmap for others. They can anticipate your responses, measure your limits, and exploit your triggers. True power, however, is rooted in the ability to remain unmoved, to maintain equilibrium regardless of external provocations. Emotional neutrality is not coldness, it is mastery of the self and control over the social dynamic. Neutrality creates uncertainty in others, and uncertainty is one of the strongest deterrents to disrespect. People are naturally risk-averse when outcomes are unpredictable. When they cannot read your emotional state, they cannot calculate the cost of crossing you, and hesitation becomes the default behavior. Anger communicates transparency. It is a signal that a line has been crossed, and that consequences are imminent. Neutrality communicates something far subtler but far more intimidating. It signals that the line exists, but the timing and manner of enforcement are entirely yours to determine. The other party is forced to consider their actions carefully because there is no visible emotional indicator to manipulate or predict. This unpredictability generates respect organically, without confrontation or argument. Neutrality also allows for strategic observation. When you are not emotionally involved, you can see patterns, motivations, and weaknesses with clarity. Most people respond reflexively, reacting to perceived offenses or slights, and in doing so, they blind themselves to the underlying dynamics at play. By remaining detached, You gain a panoramic view of the social landscape. You can identify who is opportunistic, who tests boundaries, and who acts out of ignorance versus deliberate disrespect. This perspective enables precise, calculated decisions rather than impulsive reactions. Neutrality transforms response from reflex to strategy. Moreover, neutrality changes the way your presence is perceived. People who are emotionally reactive invite challenge and escalation. They are readable, predictable, and therefore exploitable. Those who maintain composure, however, are difficult to categorize. Their intentions, tolerance, and decision-making remain obscured, and the unknown creates a psychological barrier. Individuals instinctively tread lightly around someone whose internal state is inaccessible because misjudgment carries higher personal cost. In this sense, emotional neutrality is both a shield and a subtle form of control. It protects you from unnecessary engagement while compelling others to adjust their behavior. Consistency is key. Occasional neutrality can appear artificial, but habitual control over emotional expression signals that authority is inherent, not performative. Over time, this develops a reputation that precedes interaction. People learn that crossing boundaries carries unpredictable but inevitable consequences, and that hesitation is safer than testing. Emotional neutrality, combined with calculated enforcement when necessary, creates a social environment where respect is earned through presence rather than argument, where authority is assumed rather than demanded, and where control is silent but absolute. Ultimately, neutrality is the intersection of power and perception. It transforms weakness into strength, unpredictability into dominance, and composure into deterrence. Those who master it become unreadable, unprovocable, and quietly commanding. Emotional neutrality is the language of the elite, where strength is not shouted but felt, and respect is not requested but compelled. Most disrespect disappears when you stop signaling availability for it. This is a principle that eludes nearly everyone, yet it is foundational to understanding power and social dynamics. Many people unconsciously invite mistreatment by projecting accessibility through tone, posture, energy, and emotional responsiveness. They react, explain, justify, and over-explain, inadvertently teaching others exactly how far they can push. Each interaction becomes a map for behavior, detailing the limits of tolerance and the points of vulnerability. Disrespect thrives in environments where boundaries are perceived as optional, mutable, or dependent on approval. The aware, however, understand that authority is communicated through controlled inaccessibility rather than agitation or insistence. This does not mean detachment in the sense of avoidance or arrogance. Rather, it is a deliberate calibration of engagement. When someone disrespects you, you must evaluate whether reaction, correction, or continued exposure serves a strategic purpose. Most people respond reflexively, assuming that a visible display of strength will restore equilibrium. In truth, such reactions often signal availability, the energy expended, the emotion shown, and the attention given all indicate that their behavior has had effect. By consciously reducing availability through measured withdrawal, silence, or selective engagement, you convey a much clearer and more impactful message. Access to you is not guaranteed, and it is contingent upon respect. The psychological impact of this approach is profound. Humans are wired to respond to scarcity and loss. When your attention, approval, or presence becomes limited, others are forced to reassess their behavior. Disrespect, which once flowed freely, now encounters invisible resistance. Individuals begin to question the safety, predictability, and reward of crossing your boundaries. Even subtle changes, delayed replies, shortened interactions, or absence from social situations signal a recalibration of authority. People do not consciously articulate this process, yet their actions adjust in response to the implicit consequences. In effect, respect becomes self-enforced because the risk of disrespect now carries tangible, immediate feedback. Self-mastery underpins this principle. Those who reduce availability effectively are not reacting from fear, pride, or spite. They are exercising control over energy, attention, and presence. The moment you respond emotionally, you hand leverage back to the other party. When you maintain composure while selectively limiting access, you reclaim that leverage and embed authority silently into every interaction. The key is consistency. Intermittent withdrawal or selective enforcement signals uncertainty, leaving room for testing. Predictable, reliable inaccessibility signals stability and inevitability. It teaches others that boundaries are not temporary obstacles, they are structural realities. Moreover, reducing availability amplifies the perception of power. Most people evaluate influence not by explicit declarations, but by subtle cues: who controls their presence, who responds without urgency, and who is strategically disengaged. By limiting engagement with those who disrespect you, you create a psychological weight that is difficult to challenge. Others instinctively measure their behavior against your unspoken standards, becoming more cautious, deferential, and respectful without requiring confrontation. This is the essence of quiet dominance, authority achieved through the management of presence rather than the assertion of force. Finally, this approach reshapes social hierarchies. Those who are easily available invite repeated challenges, while those who calibrate access establish unspoken rules that others obey. Disrespect becomes costly because it carries immediate, perceivable consequences. Over time, individuals internalize the lesson: your presence is conditional, your attention is selective, and your authority is undeniable. You do not need to prove strength. Strength is assumed when it is not advertised. The mastery of availability is mastery of influence itself. Those who understand this principle move through the social world with quiet, inexorable control, making disrespect rare, risky, and self-limiting. By withdrawing availability strategically, you create an environment where respect is no longer requested, but automatically earned. The awareness of your own inaccessibility transforms interactions, recalibrates social norms, and elevates your presence above challenge. Disrespect fades because it is no longer tolerated, not through argument, but through the silent, structural assertion of authority. This is the hallmark of elite influence: quiet, deliberate, and inevitable dominance. The final rule of handling disrespect is deceptively simple: never correct it emotionally, socially, or publicly. Most people believe that confrontation or verbal correction is necessary to assert authority. They assume that disrespect must be answered immediately with visible intensity or argumentation to prevent escalation. In reality, emotional or social correction often does the opposite. It communicates that the offense has impacted you, exposing your thresholds and providing a roadmap for future testing. The individuals who cross boundaries learn quickly which buttons to press, how far they can push, and what reactions are most effective. In this way, the act of correction itself perpetuates vulnerability rather than eliminating it. True control lies not in explanation, but in action that aligns consequences with behavior. Structural correction, rather than verbal confrontation, is the foundation of effective authority. When someone disrespects you, the most powerful response is to alter the environment, shift access, or impose tangible consequences. This is not about punishment in an emotional sense, it is about teaching through reality. If someone repeatedly interrupts, challenges, or undermines you, reduce their influence over your time, attention, or resources. If they attempt to bypass your boundaries in social settings, change the conditions of those interactions so the behavior becomes costly or ineffective. Humans respond to consequence far more reliably than to argument. By letting reality communicate limits, you remove the need for justification, persuasion, or debate. The message is clear: disrespect carries weight, and the rules are non-negotiable. The principle of subtle enforcement also leverages human psychology. Most people are more responsive to indirect, structural signals than to explicit admonitions. When a line is crossed and the world around the offender changes, the brain registers cause and effect almost subconsciously. The shift may be in access, tone, engagement, or consequence, but it is unmistakable. Over time, patterns of structural enforcement teach compliance without the drama of repeated confrontation. People internalize the consequences of disrespect before you ever need to speak. The effectiveness of this method lies in its quiet inevitability. Those who repeatedly experience controlled, non-emotional correction begin to adjust their behavior automatically, often without conscious awareness of the lessons being imparted. Consistency is critical. Inconsistency signals opportunity. If you enforce consequences unpredictably, or if some offenses are tolerated while others are not, the pattern becomes unreliable. Testing then continues because boundaries appear flexible. By contrast, consistent structural enforcement communicates stability and unassailable authority. The individual understands that the rules exist independently of mood, circumstance, or persuasion, which makes further testing irrational. The perception of inevitability is often more powerful than the consequence itself. People will often preemptively adjust their behavior simply because they know a misstep carries certain and unavoidable ramifications. Finally, the mastery of structural correction creates a self-reinforcing system of authority. When boundaries are consistently enforced through reality, rather than argument, respect becomes embedded in the social and psychological environment. People learn to navigate your presence with caution. They hesitate before overstepping, and they begin to recognize that their actions, rather than your words, determine outcomes. Over time, this method cultivates an aura of untouchable dominance. You are not reactive, you are inevitable. Disrespect ceases not because it is policed vocally, but because it becomes objectively costly and strategically unwise. Machiavelli's insight was clear: people adapt faster to reality than to explanation. The most effective leaders, influencers, and strategic minds internalize this principle, shaping behavior not through argument, but through controlled, predictable, and unavoidable consequences. When implemented correctly, this principle transforms interactions entirely. Individuals understand that crossing you has direct and immediate effects, and repeated testing becomes irrational. Authority is communicated silently, firmly, and structurally, leaving no room for debate or manipulation. This is power in its purest forms: absolute, inevitable, and quietly enforced. Those who master it move through the social world untouchable, unreadable, and inherently respected. If this sharpened your awareness, like the video and subscribe. Quiet power compounds over time. Final truth: people do not respect what argues, they respect what cannot be moved. Sit with that.